Okay, I think we'll get started. Good well, greetings to all. I am Adam Lupel, Executive Director of Coalition for the UN We Need, C4UN, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to this kickoff of the 2026 European Regional Futures Forum. Let me start. Many thanks to our co-organizers, Peace Child International, ECERCM, and SDG Watch Europe, as well as our co-sponsors, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, Article 109, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, PNND, and our old friends at the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy. Thank you to all. Is with everything that C4UN does. This has been a group effort, and I want to especially shout out my colleague Matilda Bodert, who is our person in Geneva. The regional futures forums hold a central place in C4UN strategic plan for this year. They follow a similar series of meetings that were held in 2023 and 2024 in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, and the UN Civil Society Conference in Nairobi in May of 2024, which I think many of you took part in. C4UN was a co-organizing partner. And building on this experience and leveraging additional engagement on the UN 80 initiative with member states and the Secretariat, as well as civil society last year and this year, we are convening these regional futures forums now between February and May. And each one is being led by regional partners in C4UN's network and facilitated by the C4UN Secretariat. And critically, they are all being structured to lead into a global futures forum to be held in July, July 11th to be specific, on the margins of the HLPF as part of a co-created series of events being organized with the Executive Office of the Secretary General, DESA, and MDOS, the major groups and other stakeholders. We'll have more to say about that as the sessions progress. Together, all these processes will aim to build a people's perspective on the vision for a revitalized multilateral system. And this will include contributing regional perspectives to ongoing UN 80 reform and the implementation of the Pact for the Future. And so the outcome document from this forum will feed into those discussions. It will also seek to bridge national and local inputs into the selection of the next Secretary General, and critically to start the process to co-create a draft people's framework to inform the 2028 high-level review of the Pact for the Future. The European Regional Futures Forum is our second forum to get going. We've recently completed the Asia Futures Forum, and my colleague Jebelson, who organized those, is on the call. Those were held in 3 sessions in February, March, and in April. The Africa Futures Forum will kick off later this month and into May, as will the Latin America Futures Forum and the MENA Futures Forum. Also will be taking place by mid-May. We also held a Pacific Futures Forum late last year, so we're really trying to get a full regional perspective here. Following the completion of all these regional forums, we will have a virtual meeting of all the regional partners, and everyone here can be invited to that to help to coordinate on how we want to structure the outcome documents and such for the global event in July. I should also mention that this is all taking place at a time when C4UN is engaging in a membership drive. And so we really want to encourage all of you and all your organizations to connect with us, whether through our mailing lists or individually between me or Matilda, and become members of C4UN. We've got a new membership application process that has been kicked off on our website. C4UN, please take a look for us there. And I think maybe Matilda will say a few words about that later. I'm going to leave it there. We've got a lot to discuss. This will first be introducing next opening remarks by video, and then Nelia Rachmanova will give a fuller overview of the agenda and the conversation for the day. So first, though, I'd like to introduce. We're really grateful to have a contribution in video form from our friend Themba Kalua, Director for the Pact of the Future Implementation from the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Please cue the video. Thank you.
Distinguished colleagues and partners, my name is Themba Kalua. I am the Director for Pact for the Future Implementation in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. It is an honor to share this message with you, and I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Coalition for the UN We Need and their regional partners for creating these important spaces for dialogue, reflection, and collaboration. Nearly a year and a half after its adoption, the Pact for the Future is moving from commitment to implementation. It stands as one of the most ambitious global agreements in recent years, designed to reinvigorate multilateralism, accelerate SDGs, and respond to rapidly evolving challenges such as the governance of artificial intelligence. Implementation is advancing across the UN system. The Secretary General Steering Committee, which he chairs, and thematic working groups are driving progress on the Pact's 56 actions. This includes efforts to reform the international financial architecture, as well as the launch of the Independent Scientific Panel on AI and the Global Dialogue on AI Governance. Importantly, implementation is not confined to UN headquarters in New York. Across all regions, UN resident coordinators, regional commissions, civil society partners, and research institutions are localizing Pact's commitments into country-level action and partnership that connect global ambition with local realities. Yet we must acknowledge the significant headwinds we face. Politically, multilateral system is under strain. Geopolitical tensions, declining trust make collective action more difficult precisely when cooperation is most urgently needed. Financially, many countries are grappling with shrinking fiscal space, rising debt burdens. This limits their ability to invest in resilience, social protection, climate adaptation, and inclusive growth. Institutionally, we must continue strengthening coordination across the UN system and ensure that global governance structures are fit for purpose in a rapidly changing world. The Pact for the Future directly addresses these pressures, but meaningful implementation at scale requires sustained political will, adequate financing, and inclusive governance. This is where civil society plays a vital role in ensuring that the Pact delivers real results for people and communities. Regional and cross-regional forums, such as the Future Fora led by C4UN, provide a unique platform for peer learning and collective problem solving. Civil society engagement in these processes ensure that regional perspectives share global implementation and that the Pact commitments are informed by lived realities of communities worldwide. Allow me to highlight three strategies. First, sustained engagement and monitoring. Civil society organizations are essential in tracking progress, identifying gaps, and ensuring transparency. Your independent analysis and field experience help anchor implementation in reality and hold institutions accountable. Second, strengthening regional and cross-regional collaboration. While regions are diverse, we all face shared challenges, from climate vulnerability to digital inequality. Cooperation across regions can amplify civil society's voices and shape approaches that feed into global processes. Third, co-creation of solutions. The Pact calls for inclusive governance. Civil society brings innovation, community knowledge, and accountability mechanisms that are indispensable for designing policies that work, whether on digital governance, climate resilience, financing for development, or youth empowerment. The Pact for the Future is not merely a negotiated text. It is a platform for action and accountability. Its success depends on partnerships across government, the UN system, and civil society. As you look ahead to the Global Futures Forum, the Pact Review in 2028, and the broader reform efforts, including UN80, your engagement will be critical to ensure that global commitments translate into tangible improvements in people's lives. Thank you for your leadership, for your partnership, and for your steadfast commitment to shaping a more just, inclusive, and sustainable future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and I will allow myself to take the floor right now, just because, yeah, we have really tight schedule today. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you very much, Adam, for the great introduction. My name is Nela Rahimova, and I will be moderating the first panel of the session. We today, just for those who haven't seen, we will have two panels today discussing in detail the situation around Pact of the Future, as well as UN80, but in general, the situation with multilateralism right now in the world. And but before we start, I just would like again to remind everyone, just please keep yourself muted if possible. We don't want to interrupt our speakers. Also, because we have really tight schedule, as I mentioned today, we would like you to ask questions to the panelists in the chat because it would be the most convenient way for us. So please feel free when speakers even speaking to raise your questions. We will try our best to collect them. At the same time, just be aware that we are recording this session. So if you have any security issues for your name to be open, you can rename yourself. But of course, we will also, we will be happy to actually see, if possible, your name and organization which you represent when you ask the questions. I'm happy to announce that also this whole session will be facilitated together with the colleagues who actually helped to organize this event. It's Mathilde Godard and David Wolcom, and Mathilde will moderate Q&A sessions, while David will actually moderate the second panel. So yeah, happy to have you colleagues here, and I think it was a great collaboration, and but we are not done yet. So yeah, I just don't want to take more time because, as I said, we have many speakers, we have lots of interesting topics to discuss today, and I will start with introduction of the first panel. In the first panel, we will have three speakers. It's Ishan Shah from C4UN, Sofia Garcia from Article 109 Coalition, and Guillaume Lafortune from SDSN. And I will start with introduction of Ishan, and I hope, Ishan, you are here with us. I know that it's a really busy time right now around Youth Forum, but we are happy to have you here with us. Ishan, are you here with us?
Yes, I am. Good morning, colleagues.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Just making sure. So Ishan is a multilateral policy expert and global lead next generation fellow at United Nations Foundation. He also leads intergovernmental engagement and Pact of the Future follow-up at the coalition for the UN we need, with expertise spanning UN governance processes, system reform, and global policy advocacy. And we invited today Ishan actually to give us an overview on the progress made since the adoption of the Pact, including key milestones ahead, such as UN80 and the broader political and institutional developments shaping the future of the multilateral system. So please, Ishan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here this morning, and it's great to see familiar names and familiar faces. Let me start by saying congratulations to the co-organizers for these forums. It's great to have these spaces where we can convene a civil society and exchange these views amidst shrinking civic space as well. It's great to sustain this momentum. And in that regard, the Pact is alive. The Pact and its annexes, I should say, they are alive. They are living, they are breathing, they are moving across the UN system. and progress is being made across the 363 commitments and action items that member states agreed to back in September of 2024, one of the latest signs of consensus amongst the 193 family members of the UN itself. So it's great to see that progress across all 5 chapters and the 2 annexes itself. We had the Financing for Development conference last year, which did have an outcome, mostly consensus. And yesterday we had the launch of the borrowers platform as a key milestone for borrowers to convene, to discuss, as a space for them to really look at how they should be looking at financing for development more comprehensively, and a place for them to organize as well as the member states themselves. So FFD was, not the most ambitious outcome, but it was a success in its own regard in some aspects of it. And we have seen those conversations continue, and hopefully next week, as the FFD forum convenes here in New York, as part of the ECOSOC, those conversations, will continue to sustain momentum there. On chapter 2 around peace and security, we have made progress on those initiatives there. The group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapons convenes regularly. We have the second independent progress study on youth and peace and security being launched shortly. I have a conversation about that later today. So there will be more movement. On chapter 3, on sort of the Global Digital Compact, those conversations are ongoing. We have the scientific panel on AI and the global dialogue upcoming in Geneva. Those conversations are moving. Maria Ressa, who is the chair of that panel, is very excited to push for those conversations, despite some pushback from several member states. But those conversations are ongoing. The Beyond GDP panel is short to publishing their report as well. We had a great conversation with some of their panel experts recently, to look at sort of their findings and what they're ready to publish. And, we can really say that will trigger an intergovernmental process that we're really looking forward to engaging with. On chapter 4 on youth and future generations, one of my favorite chapters, given how strong the language is in that chapter. We have seen progression across the Youth Fund, the Global Youth Investment Platform, the inclusion of youth delegates within member state delegations to the UN itself. And then, of course, recently the launch of the core principles on meaningful youth participation, which took place on the margins of the Commission on the Status of Women earlier this year. The DFG is being implemented as well, although progress on that is slightly slower than we had anticipated. There is now a group of friends co-chaired by Jamaica and the Netherlands on future generations. There will be a retreat later this month, convening member states in the direction of how we can strengthen the implementation of the declaration itself. And then we have also just recently seen, a couple of weeks ago, when a resolution as part of the UN80 initiative on the mandates review process, language taken directly from the Declaration of Future Generations was included in that text. So normative gains are being made, and the normative spirit of the Pact and its annexes are being sustained across the system. And then on transforming global governance, the IGN intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform continue. On Tuesday of this week, member states convened for a debate on the veto. We had last year the successful adoption of the revitalization of the Commission on the Status of Women, again, which came from the Pact itself, and conversations around the General Assembly's review of the Economic and Social Council and high-level political forum are ongoing. And as we look to 2027, the final SDG summit in HLPF 2027, where the high-level political forum there is invited to consider the post-2030 agenda, the future of the development agenda. We look forward to those conversations sustaining on the road to 2028, where we'll have the formal review of the Pact itself, as well as its annexes. So that's a snapshot overview of the implementation itself. And along the way, we're seeing that the PGA, the President of the General Assembly, is convening dialogues, better together dialogues on the Pact implementation. And also there are several conversations happening with civil society consultations as such that C4UN is proud to help facilitate. I'm not sure if I've overstayed my time there, but want to stick and respect other speakers in that regard. But I hope that provides a brief snapshot. There is a brilliant website that the Executive Office of the Secretary General has convened on progress of the Pact for the Future. I think around 53% of actions from the Secretariat side have already been implemented. So the momentum is there. We just need to keep talking about the Pact and its annexes and keeping up that momentum. I have a lot of faith in the Pact. I remember reading that 264-page compilation text. I will never forget it. So it's something that's ingrained in my mind, and we hope that we can sustain those conversations and sustain that level of ambition that we had in 2024.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ishan. If you can share the link to this webpage that you mentioned, it would be great. I think it would be really useful for colleagues to have a look because indeed it's a great material. But thank you very much for your intervention. And please, just to remind everyone, if you have any questions to Ishan, you can write them in the chat. And I would like to invite our second speaker immediately, just for the sake of time, Sofia Garcia, who is the Director of Advocacy and Partnership at Article 109 Coalition. Sofia has over 15 years of experience leading campaigns and engaging constituencies in UN processes, ensuring inclusive and impactful participation of children, young people, and other communities in drafting of the SDGs, Global Compact of Migration, and Pact itself. So Sofia is Spanish national and lives in New York. And we invited Sofia to share her insights at the UN reform, looking at the progress in strengthening global governance, including the UN 80 initiative, role also of European countries and stakeholders, what kind of role they can play in shaping of this future direction and the leadership and in general the effectiveness of the UN system. So Sofia, please.
Good morning from New York and afternoon, I guess, for many of you in Europe. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks again for the invitation for C4UN, a highly esteemed partner of Article 109. I'm going to take your questions, Nelia, in the reverse order, so starting from the last one, what role European governments and stakeholders can play. And just because we have 5 minutes, I thought, let me give some pointers that hopefully then lead to a discussion in this session and the upcoming session next week. And we can really figure this out together. What European countries can do is, to state the obvious, and should do is step up and lead. I feel that in the last months, the European Union is doing an exercise, the European Union and Europe in its complex and broadest sense, has been on the reactive side of defining the new multilateralism paradigm. And it's now time to start putting ink on paper and actions and taking step. And that requires, first of all, and is where we as a civil society can put the right pressure and can focus on the right issues, that requires to do an introspection on what our values are. Europe gave birth to the system where we operate. Europe designed the system where we currently operate and should play a role on the system going ahead, defending the values that define Europe. They should do it together. So when there is division within Europe, whether it is amongst civil society or governments, nobody wins and the leadership wins down. So it's a matter of getting together and start developing that vision, those principles and those values that we want to operate in. And I think more concretely, an exercise that has to be done, and we feel it's being done, is to take a step back. And by we now, I mean both governments and us as civil society, and rethink what we are doing in the current context. The context where the SDGs were designed, and even the Pact of the Future, which was only a year and change ago, but sometimes feels like a century ago, right? The context was very different. We are in a completely different reality that is evolving. So we need to, as Ishan was saying, keep talking about the Pact for the Future and keep pushing for it, but we need to do it aware of the context where we operate, where basically the base, the system, the paradigm, and the operating structure where those pacts, where the Pact and the SDGs were created, is now under question. And that's maybe a good way to talk about UN 80 and exemplify the point I'm trying to make, which is sometimes I wonder if we are fully aware when the conversation around how to make the UN system more effective is about, for some, of course, about questioning how the UN worked and how it can work better, and when it is about questioning the very existence of the principles of the institution. One thing is the institution and the system, and another thing is the principles. And we need to defend, we need to go for efficiency on one, but strong defense of the other. We cannot allow that the reform being run as a technocratic exercise is not informed by a vision that we want a strong UN and a UN that is at the center of the global conversations, right? So we need to think together, and I think this is a perfect forum to do that, on making sure that our actions, our joint actions, and our coordinated actions to defend the Pact for the future are one, within that context, and two, that maybe we can get, and European civil society has a lot of experience doing that, that we can do it in a coordinated way and at two speeds, that we focus on making sure that the actions and commitments of the Pact are implemented, but that we also take the crisis or opportunity, depending on how you see it. And sorry for the police noises in New York City, this is what happens in a Zoom call, but that we really do it at two speeds, that we focus on what we can do and have to do now, and want to put pressure on governments to implement, but also to take this opportunity to rethink the system from the base, as it has been questioned, right? Never waste a good crisis. And part of the legitimacy crisis of the UN, and what prevents us from being able to really push for the implementation of the Pact that, as Ishan was saying, should be our guiding light for action, at least until 2028, when we have a bigger conversation, is we need to have that focus on making that happen, but focus on changing what prevents us from happening. And this is where, and doing it with an informed vision of not only how do we want the Pact to succeed, but how do we want the UN system to succeed, right? We should develop together that vision of what is the new multilateral paradigm, because that is the question that, whether we like it or not, and probably we don't, is on the question, redefining the new paradigm. And that's where Article 109 comes in. Article 109 coalition focuses on calling and encouraging member states and bringing together civil society actors to think of perhaps renewing, updating, and making even more relevant for the times the UN Charter. Article 109 of the Charter, and I won't go into the details because I'm aware of time, calls for a reform conference, calls for member states to review the Charter, and this may be a good time to look at it, develop the vision of what is not working, why is not working, what are temporary or of the moment threats to the system or the implementation of the Pact, and what are more structural causes, as for example, the lack of participation in the design process of 3/4 of the current membership and many others, and then act upon it. I will end with a call to read, and I share it in the chat, the latest statement of Kaja Kallas in the UN Security Council last week. I'll put it in the chat. But she was asking the Security Council, how do we transform the ailing multilateral system? They are asking us, I think we should ask them. And then just with a quote, connecting and closing with Ishan's last point on the future generations, Thomas Jefferson said that every generation has the right to choose for itself the form of government the most promotive of its own happiness. So our call is to make sure that we focus on implementing now what has to be changed now in order to prevent further loss of life and opportunity, but also to focus on defining the broader vision for it.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And I think it's indeed very important to mention this about future generations. And we will have actually, in the end, we will talk more about that part of the Pact also. So now I just will really quickly jump to Guillaume. Guillaume is Vice President of Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and since 2017, he's coordinated the preparation of the Sustainable Development reports, which well known as SDG Index, and especially what is interesting for us today, I think it's European edition. And as I represent ECE regional engagement mechanism, which is one of regional constituencies of MGOS and also SDG Watch Europe. Of course, I would be delighted to hear what is the state of SDG implementation in Europe right now, and what can we do about it? Like, how can we still push for the progress? So, Guillaume.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nelia, and thank you to all the organizers, the Coalition for the UN, SDG Watch Europe, and everybody else mentioned by Adam at the beginning. I'm indeed vice president at SDSN, which is the largest global network of researchers and scientists mobilized for the SDGs. I'll try to be factual, short, also. All the information that I'm going to share today is accessible on our website. It's public goods, but everything that we do, we try to anchor it into science, metrics, and data. So a lot of what I'm going to say today is actually based on research work and statistics and data. So there were two questions, I think, for today. One was indeed around the reform of the UN system, and the other one was more focused on the role of Europe. So I'll start with the reform of the UN, and the question was how much progress did we make in advancing strengthening global governance? Well, in my opinion, we made limited progress. There's less than 20% of the SDGs that are on track to be achieved. Right now, this is our data. We publish it every year. It's been mentioned in the Sustainable Development Report, not because the goals are not a good idea, not because they're impossible to achieve at the global level, but due to failures in international governance and national governance systems at times. Most importantly, the UN, we're in a very special moment right now. The UN is clearly under attack. So I like, of course, all the glass half full discourse, but I think we also have to point out where we see major issues. There's been some quotes said, I think Albert Camus, a French author, said not to name things or to misname things is adding to the misery of the world, where I think we have to say that a number of influential UN member states are actually working against the UN system. And this is why we're not able to make a lot of progress on many of the issues at stake, including on the SDGs. So we do every year, we have an index of countries' support for UN-based multilateralism. And the whole idea is to say, well, in order for the United Nations to work, nations need to want to be united. It cannot work if nations don't want to work with each other. And so we've looked at the numbers of treaties, UN treaties that countries ratify, their memberships in UN organizations. Do they pay their dues to the UN on time or not? Do they tend to adopt illegal sanctions against the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. So a whole set of measures related to your support to UN-based multilateralism. So since we've started doing this, Barbados actually ranks first. So, congratulations, Prime Minister Mia Mottley. The United States ranks last, and the situation has actually deteriorated over the past couple of months, as you can imagine. This is all public data, but last year, for all the UNGA votes, with the recorded vote at the UN, the US voted with the international majority 5% of the time. This is much lower than what we observe in many of the major countries in the world, whether it's China, for instance, of course, European countries and most other powers. So all these statistics are accessible online, of course, so I don't have time today to go further into the details. We will update this when we will launch the next edition of the Global Sustainable Development Report on the 23rd of June. So that's the first problem. We have a number of countries, I would say the US, I think some of its allies, also Israel, are working against the UN system, which doesn't help for reform. I think the other issue, by the way, is I personally think there's an issue with the framing of the UN 80 initiative. It's largely about efficiency and doing more with less. So avoiding some degree of duplication, of course, across mandates and agencies is fine. But if we all agree with that, we have a growing number of global challenges with war, climate issue, AI, pandemics, then the main issue at stake, in my opinion, is how do we increase the capacities of the UN to work effectively? The core budget of the UN is 3.7 billion USD a year. This is a fraction of the core budget of major cities like Paris and New York. And on top of this, countries tend to pay late or actually do not pay at all. So of course, there will be a new UN Secretary General in a few weeks. But I think this is something as civil society organization we should keep in mind. Another point on the reform of the UN system, I am just coming back from China. As emphasized by my president, Jeff Sachs, I think it might be time to think about a major UN hub on energy decarbonization and clean technologies in China to complement other hubs in New York, Paris, Geneva, and Nairobi. It's easier, I think, to meet right now and forge partnerships around clean energy in China than it is to do it in the US, which of course just left for the second time the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's on the UN reform. On the role of European countries, well, let me emphasize 2 points. I think for European countries, coherence is very important. Coherence in its support for the UN Charter and a rules-based international order. All the attacks against, of course, territorial integrity are unacceptable, whether they happen in Greenland or elsewhere around the world. And we've seen Europeans ahead of Davos, of course, reacting very strongly in the context of the Greenland crisis. I think it's very important to have the same level of reaction every time there's an attack against territorial integrity. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter considers that the use or the threat of the use of force is illegal according to international law. Then I think for Europeans, it's also about forging new partnership and renewed leadership structured around the SDGs. The so-called global south, which I don't really like the term, in my opinion, is now the global majority, the majority of the world population, the majority of economic activity, and the majority that still stands behind the UN and the SDGs. So if we look at the resolution again last year, focusing on the implementation of the Civil commitment on financing for sustainable development, there's a large majority, 180 countries, that continue to vote in favor of those resolutions. There's always 1 to 3 countries that vote against, but there's a strong global majority that still supports the paradigm of sustainable development. Europe should continue to build bridges with China, India, Brazil, Latin America, and the African Union. Of course, we're not achieving the SDGs. Less than 20% are on track. The US opposes this agenda. But again, the rest of the global majority stays firmly behind this. And there are 190 countries presented voluntary national review. 3 have not: the US, Haiti, and Myanmar. 36 more will do so in July at the UN High-Level Political Forum. So we promoted with partners of civil society in Europe, notably the European Economic and Social Committee, a concept which we called European Green Deal / SDG diplomacy, which was basically our way of saying Europe should mainstream the SDGs and the European Green Deal in all its foreign partnerships. Unfortunately, and this is what Nelia was alluding to, we published a report on Europe where we tracked the performance of Europe on the SDGs. And what we see, I mean, we knew there was a backlash, of course, against the European Green Deal. But we do see actually in the, for instance, the European Commission work program that there's no longer any reference to the global framework, the Sustainable Development Goals or 2030 agenda. So if you look at each year, the European Commission issues an annual work program with key priorities for the next years. It used to make reference to the SDGs and 2030 agenda. Over the past 2 years, it is no longer making any reference to this agenda. And this coincides with the second von der Leyen mandate. So I think I'll stop here just to say, if I want to be very specific, I mean, of course, we'll have a new Secretary General in a few weeks. There's an SDG summit in 2027, which hopefully can pave the way for an ambitious renewal or extension of the Sustainable Development Goals. I agree with what's been said, by the way, at the beginning. I think the next set of goals and frameworks should emphasize implementation, but also regional approaches. There's a lot of advantages in driving those transformations at the regional or continental level. Also in terms of financing, there's a lot of regional banks that can be further mobilized to implement these goals. And concretely, what we've been advocating towards the European leadership is first to issue a joint statement from the Council, the Parliament, and Commission, recommitting Europe to the SDGs and to an ambitious post-2030 framework. Issue a second EU voluntary review ahead of 2027, so ahead of the SDG summit at heads of state level, recreate a civic space to discuss pathways for the SDGs. You'll remember that during the Juncker Commission, there used to be a multi-stakeholder platform on the SDGs. It was discontinued by the von der Leyen Commission, but I think there needs to be a space to discuss pathways, policies, investments for the SDGs, perhaps coordinated by the European Economic and Social Committee or other actors, but I think there's a void right now. Then promote SDG and the European Green Deal and the reform of the global financial architecture in all international fora. France has the G7 presidency right now. Of course, the US has the G20 presidency, where a lot of the discussion on international finance happened, but afterwards it will move to the United Kingdom. So again, part of the European family. And then in my opinion, and I'll end with this, I think it's absolutely urgent for Europe to address the fragmentation in its capital market. And to implement the so-called savings and investment union so that European savings are actually used more effectively to advance the green and digital transformation of Europe and in Europe, and not to finance US tech or military industry. We know that a lot of European savings are actually shifting each year to the US. I think that can be, by the way, part of the whole idea of achieving strategic autonomy. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you, Nadia, for the invitation. I'll have to run, unfortunately, very quickly, but I'll stay 2-3 minutes or 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for this very rich and very specific presentation as well. Thanks also to Ishan and Sophia for their inputs. So let me reintroduce myself. I'm Mathilde Baudard, and I represent the Coalition for the UN We Need in Geneva as the Geneva Policy and Advocacy Coordinator. Very excited to be on this call with so many participants and institutions from Europe. So before you leave, Guillaume, I see one question has been raised in the chat for you specifically. So I'll start with this one and then move on with a few other questions as they come in. Gabriele asked, what is the position of SDSN on Russia's invasion of Ukraine? You've briefly touched on that, but I don't know if you want to add anything on this specifically.
Well, I don't want to talk about specific issues or conflict areas. It's not. I like to talk about where I have expertise on, and not on specific context. I don't have a specific expertise on Ukraine. In general, the SDSN position in that there should be strong support for rules-based international order, for the UN Charter, and we've tried to be a force of proposition throughout the years. If you look at, because the Summit of the Future was mentioned multiple times today, before the Summit of the Future, we gathered a large number of academics and experts, and we have made a number of clear recommendations about how to strengthen the UN system, but also help the UN and its member states to prevent crises, but also address them quickly and effectively when they happen, whether they are pandemics or geopolitical crises.
Thanks, Guillaume. There's another question in the chat from Hernan. What, in your opinion, would be the degree of achievement of SDGs be reached in the year 2030, and what after that? Maybe the question can go to you first, Guillaume, and then I may invite Sophia and Ishan to come in if they have any input on this. Guillaume.
Sorry, I missed that part. What was the question, Mathilde? Sorry.
What degree of achievement can we expect in terms of SDGs by 2030?
So right now, less than 20% of the targets are on track, according to our estimate. What we've always said is that if you look globally speaking, it's, those goals are not impossible to achieve. We have enough financing globally. The global economy is 100 trillion USD a year. Global savings is about 30 trillion USD a year. The SDG financing gap by UNCTAD, the estimate by UNCTAD is about 4 trillion a year. I think it's underestimated, by the way. But if you look at the financing gap in the larger scope of the amount of financing available, especially global savings, there's nothing impossible here. It's all about how do we channel more of the global savings so that they can be used to invest in the right sets of investment, green and digital technologies. And that's why, in my opinion, the reform of the global financial architecture is absolutely key. And then when you look at the technologies available, it's the same. We see it with AI, digital technologies, even for energy decarbonization. But again, here, the key challenge is how do we share these technologies equally? How do we do this in an ethical way? And I think, again, here we need global governance to achieve this. So for sure, we won't achieve all the SDGs everywhere by 2030. I think, from the start, this was always known that we wouldn't achieve everything everywhere by 2030. And this is why the next phase, in my opinion, should really focus on extending or raising the ambition of this framework, but also working on the implementation. And the implementation has a lot to do with strengthening global governance framework.
Thanks, Guillaume. Maybe before you come in, Sophia and Ishan, on this very question, let me also read another question that one of you may want to address. From Claire from Jamaica. She says, I'm interested in the follow-up to the Pact for the Future. How can I help this network advocate with the Jamaican government to advance the future generation work, especially with the Global South? I am based in the US, but I'm plugged into people in the SIDS or SIDS, Africa and the Caribbean, and people in the Global South Futures community. So if maybe Ishan, you want to come in on that, and if you want to comment also on SDGs and the degree of achievement by 2030. And then I will invite Sophia to also comment on this if she wants.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the questions as well. I think I fully agree with what's just been said around SDG achievement. I don't think we will achieve all the SDGs, but I think that it's important to look at what we achieved in 2015, the momentum and the movement building, particularly from the grassroots and civil society networks that really contributed to, many of the goals that we have today, SDG 5, SDG 16 in particular, the ones that wouldn't have been in the agenda without the mass mobilization of civil society. What can we take from that inspiration, that movement building, and feed that to my generation, essentially, who are going to inherit a UN that is operating in a more complex world and in a more sort of politically fragmented environment. We will have a conversation later today on the margins of the ECOSOC Youth Forum alongside the Committee of Experts on Public Administration around the post-2030 agenda. What are the options that can be put on the table? How can we start these conversations now so that when we reach the high-level political forum in 2027, member states, young people, civil society are not blindsided by this conversation, but we come with something constructive to start those conversations in a more substantive way towards the 2027 SDG Summit and then on the road to 2030. With regards to this question on engaging with the Jamaican government, I would say connect with us at C4UN. We have very strong relationships with the mission here in New York, but also Jamaica has been a leader on the Pact for the Future in all its regards. They continue to champion the Declaration on Future Generations. They co-chair the Group of Friends on Future Generations itself. In almost all negotiation tracks I've been in, the Jamaica, as well as the CARICOM group and the Small Island Development States, as well as the Pacific Island Forum, consistently reference the Pact for the Future, itself as language to be taken forward in other normative processes, but also the language of the Pact itself. They sustain that momentum. They support the convening of various events, and they want to look at implementation at the local level on the Pact itself. So please connect with us at C4UN, but also keep engaging with your national government. Jamaica is very open itself to sort of looking at how we can sustain that momentum on the Pact, but also how to spotlight the urgency of the need for implementation, especially for SIDS, on the Pact for the Future and sustain that momentum, particularly with regards to climate governance.
Thanks, Ishan. Sophia, do you want to comment on those two questions?
Yes, I have just a comment, and the numbers have been given on how much they will be achieved. I will not then just repeat that, but I think I would introduce a point for discussion, especially in this group. I think something we need to think about, and what comes after the SDGs is the $1 million question, and it's really for us to coordinate, and fora like this one are very valuable for that, on what do we want to see after the SDGs, and what can we realistically achieve, right? And then find a balance between the ambition and the possibility. Something we need to be very conscious of is, and I go to one question about the citizens that I see in the chat, to think how are we going to manage the narratives of what comes next, and not only what comes next. In 2027, we are going to go through the last SDGs review, as has been said, and honestly, the news are not good. We have not delivered, and governments who were the duty bearers have not delivered. 20% is not enough, because those that are still hungry or without access to education will not care so much about the numbers. And we will need to see how do we handle 2028 and the progress made in the Pact for the Future. And the narrative should be that we need more and that we need better, and that we will address the things that prevent us from really achieving, which is lack of accountability, lack of action, etc., and address it at the root level, so that citizens still believe, and the growing levels of skepticism, I'm sure all of you see in your country, as Europe is a very good example on how we, in this call, understand it, but the average citizen is becoming more and more skeptic. So I would call, and in Article 109 Coalition are very happy to work with members and partners on this, on coordinating a narrative to make sure that those two key moments, 27 and 28, will not contribute to the deception, to the frustration that will be used by governments that want to develop narratives against the UN. You see, it was worthless. Let's throw the baby with the bathwater, right? And that we can really keep up a narrative, followed by action, of course, into positive change and asking for more and not less when it comes to the sustainable development pillar of the UN or the actions of the Pact for the Future. That's we shouldn't underestimate the power of those two moments and how we build the narratives towards more and not less.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia. We're only 10 minutes behind schedule, so I think we must move on to the second session. Again, I'd like to thank all my fellow coordinators here and all of you for joining us today in this fascinating debate. My name is David Woolcombe, and for 45 years I've led a charity called Peace Child International, designed to empower young people, and it's wonderful to see people like Ishan on this call, demonstrating quite how incredibly empowered young people have become in the last 40 years. So anyway, we're now moving on to the questions of international peace and security, looking at progress on the Pact for the Future's commitments, the key challenges that remain, and the role of European governments and civil society, the role that we can play in strengthening multilateral responses in what Nelia calls an increasingly complex geopolitical context, which I would call a context in which several UN member states seem to be happy to tear up the international order that we've lived in and enjoyed for the last 80 years. So I'm very happy that Rebecca Shute, who is an international lawyer and a democracy and governance expert, specialist in international judicial institutions, who convenes the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court and co-leads the Impact Coalition, driving global advocacy such as initiatives like the Law Not War campaign. Rebecca, your answers to these questions will be fascinating to all of us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me begin by thanking C4UN for convening this, as well as all the co-organizers, and of course, my fellow panelists. I think I need to start out by acknowledging that in a moment where world leaders can credibly threaten civilizational annihilation, it can be difficult to see how commitments regarding peace and security are meaningful and where international law is actually functioning. But if you look closely, and I think it's important that we do so, there is progress that is measurable, tangible, and in some areas accelerating. So I've been asked to focus in particular on Chapter 2 of the Pact for the Future, Peace and Security. I'm joined subsequently by my colleague, Alan Ware. I'm going to hone in specifically on 2 action points, which are actions 16 and 17, which are with regards to justice, accountability, and the role of courts, and try to answer the practical question of what does implementation of the Pact look like now. But I will situate this within Chapter 2 as a whole, and indeed within the Pact as a whole. My colleague will cover actions 19, 20, 25, and 26. Did have to write that down. But just to ensure participants that selectivity of focus is not born of bias, but our time constraints, I'll briefly note that the remaining actions in this chapter address conflict prevention, the protection of civilians, combating terrorism, and urging cooperation to combat root causes of conflict, including governance failures and corruption. But I will briefly touch on those. So what matters for my purposes is that all of these depend in different ways on whether accountability mechanisms are actually functioning. Justice, therefore, shouldn't be understood as a discrete pillar within the Pact for the Future or the SDGs or the UN system, but it's the connective tissue that allows the rest to operate. So with regard to the Pact for the Future, I would like to mention a structural issue with how implementation is being tracked. We've mentioned that there are 363 sub-actions. There are none that effectively measure justice and accountability. None. But this does not mean that nothing is happening. It means that it's not yet being systemically captured. And so that is why I want to focus here on the gap, starting with what is Action 17 within the Pact for the Future regarding international courts and tribunals. So the clearest indication and evidence that we have of implementation here is with the International Court of Justice, the World Court, the foundational instrument of accountability on which the UN is premised. And here we see participation levels at a historically unprecedented rate. Last year, roughly 100 submissions by states and non-state actors with regards to the advisory opinion regarding state obligations with regard to climate change, more than 50 states and international organizations participating in the occupied Palestinian territories advisory opinion, more than 40 states intervening in the genocide convention cases, of which there are 4 currently before the court. And now we have 75 states accepting the court's compulsory jurisdiction, including almost all European states. And so these are not just abstract signals. They tell us that even in a fragmented geopolitical environment, states are turning collectively to adjudication as a means of clarifying legal obligations. And the court, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, is integrating various kinds of law, from human rights law to environmental law, with regards to state responsibility. And so climate litigation in particular shows how obligations across domains, including due diligence and the regulation of private actors, are now being contemplated in a serious and robust way by the international court system. So that is Action 17 in practice, which is not the creation of new institutions, but the intensified use of those we already have. Now, Action 16, which is more generally worded with regards to accountability, I think can embrace both old and new initiatives. And so here, with regards to existing international courts, we must recognize that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is currently engaged in every region of the world and multiple active situations of conflict, in fact, which include Ukraine on your doorstep from all of those who are joining from Europe today, Palestine, Sudan, and Afghanistan. And Ukraine's acceptance of jurisdiction in 2024 is particularly significant. So we're, in other words, shifting towards real-time accountability in situations of atrocity and conflict. But we also must acknowledge what's at stake here. The ICC was hailed as the hope for all humanity by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and yet is facing unprecedented threats and real-time challenges. It's operating under political pressure, including targeted sanctions against the institution, its officials. For the first time, a UN official, as well as human rights organizations, seized of current conflict. And arrest warrants depend on state cooperation, which has been inconsistent, including within Europe. So implementation is active, but enforcement remains uneven. And here, as we're speaking at the European Futures Forum, I also want to gesture to the importance played by regional systems, including the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice, in advancing legal standards, particularly in relation to climate obligations, state responsibility therein. And many of the atrocities that we have that I've mentioned at the international level also play out within regional courts and tribunals, and increasingly, in fact, in domestic jurisdictions, including by use of universal jurisdiction. We wouldn't have seen accountability for some of the most heinous atrocities committed in the Syrian Arab Republic, for instance, if not for European domestic courts. So while European states have been among the most consistent supporters and users of international courts, it cannot be stressed and emphasized enough that their sustained and robust affirmation of the independence of these courts and tribunals remains paramount to ensuring that the whole system and, most importantly, justice for victims and survivors remains something more than an aspiration. I know that I'm coming up to my time, so I just want to mention a few quick points.
Just one, if possible.
Okay, so accountability, as was mentioned by my colleague Ishan in the introductory panel, is also linked to mechanisms such as the veto power. And there is increasing recognition that political initiatives to restrain the veto can and should be complemented by legal clarification, including through an advisory opinion on existing legal limits of the veto in situations involving atrocity crimes. I'll fit in just one final point, which is that as we contemplate all of this within the context of the UN 80 initiative, I think we need to be mindful about the danger of collapsing mandates and streamlining when it regards humanitarian and peacekeeping functions, which must retain their independence and their full throttle support from states, including European allies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. What a lot there was in there about the absolutely vital issue of accountability and justice. And I know that our next speaker, Alan Ware, a New Zealander, a global peace and security expert like you, Rebecca, working very closely with you on issues like the World Federalist Movement, their Institute for Global Policy, also the Global Coordinator for Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Alan, the floor is yours. I'm sure you'll be able to add brilliantly to what Rebecca has started. Over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Sorry for the delay, just finding the speak button. So, yes, I had the privilege and honor of working with Rebecca in pulling together Chapter 2 of the People's Pact for the Future, which was, of course, some of the work that civil society had done, facilitated by the Coalition for the UN We Need in preparation leading up to the Summit of the Future. And the recommendations in the Pact for the Future, I think, are also very good to sort of keep in the front of our minds as we're looking at implementation of the Pact for the Future itself. So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to be looking at actions 19, 20, 25, and 26 try and move the button. There. Is the screen moving over? Do you see the next screen? Oh, good. Okay. In the Pact for the Future, so Action 19 is Women, Peace and Security. Action 20 is Youth, Peace and Security. Action 25, the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. And Action 26, implementing disarmament commitments. And just a reminder, a lot of the focus of peace and security in Chapter 2 relates very much to Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the connection with that is very important to keep. So on women and peace and security, I'm going to look a little bit at things that are maybe gone backwards and some things which are maintaining ground or progress, looking mostly globally, but also some of the reflections within Europe. So some backwards as violence against women has increased globally. Organizations working to prevent violence against women, many have been closing down, as reported in the UN Women Report just come out in October last year, at risk and underfunded. Some countries are rescinding feminist foreign policies, including some in Europe, like Sweden, Finland have backed away from feminist foreign policies, which were part of the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Action Plan. So these are some of the backwards. But looking at the maintaining ground or progress, still more than 100 countries have national action plans to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And those action plans, of course, are interactions of governments with civil society. So that's a positive, that's been maintained. The UN Secretary General's Common Pledge for Women's Participation in Peace Processes. So the pledge was launched in October 2024. This is gaining support. So that particular aspect, which is really important, women's participation in the peace processes, is getting a lot of traction and a lot of engagement. And this is one example of that. Within the European context, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Special Rep on Gender Issues, which is working very much on implementing the Women, Peace and Security Program and engaging parliamentarians in this, is very, very active. And so too is the EU's Women, Peace and Security agenda. And that's engaging more at the governmental level. So this is keeping quite strong within the European community. And then swinging back to global, traction for a woman UN Secretary General has grown. And we know we've got candidates coming up for the public hearings in the UN General Assembly. And there are two very strong woman candidates. So, of course, it has to be the best person who will win the job. But we do, as I said, we've got two good, strong candidates, and there's a lot of traction behind that. I have put here with a QR code just an example of one of the feminist foreign policies. This is the Canadian Feminist International Development Program. This one received an award, 2024 Future Policies Award. So it gives a good example of how these are very effective, active, and making a difference. Now on to youth, peace and security. I mentioned more challenges on this one because challenges for this, and these are identified in the initial report. It's not finished yet, the UN Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security, which has gone through its consultation process but hasn't yet come up with the final report. Challenges for the Youth, Peace and Security Program include lack of funding for youth-led organizations and, of course, the lack of income base for youth to be able to engage in these activities. So if they don't have funding, it's very difficult to engage. Also, other stresses on youth that make it difficult to involve them in peace and security. That includes stresses arising from being in conflict zones, climate change impacting, lack of employment, and others. So there are some challenges there. Where there's maintaining ground or progress is there is an increasing number of national action plans on youth, peace and security, but I must say this is still quite low in comparison to the national action plans on women, peace and security. There are also a number of youth-led initiatives that are gaining political success, and Rebecca already mentioned the ICJ case on climate change. That was youth-led, started with Pacific Island students fighting climate change, moved to the World Youth for Climate Justice. It was youth who really encouraged governments to adopt the General Assembly resolution, getting this to the court, and then turning up in the court to build a very strong case that then resulted in an incredible decision from the court. Also, there continues to be a number of individual contributions from UN member states to ensure that the UN can run youth programs for the peace and security agenda. That's both to UN Youth and UN ODA. So a big thanks to the member states that have been doing that. Okay, moving on to the next one, a world free of nuclear weapons. Well, some ways this has been going backwards with increasing nuclear threats, including in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US and Israel invasion of Iran. Also, the expiration of START in February 26 with no renewal or replacement, mean there's no nuclear arms control agreements remaining between the superpowers, the big powers, should I say. Russia and the US have also announced preparations to resume nuclear testing, and all nuclear armed states are modernizing their nuclear weapons and increasing their budgets. So a lot of backwards. On maintaining ground or progress, it's important that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is held. The states parties are staying in it. We're still waiting to see if there's going to be any repercussions on this from the US-Israel invasion of Iran, but so far Iran hasn't indicated that they'll withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty because of this. The NPT review conference starts on April 27th and runs for 4 weeks, so watch this space. It's very important. Also, the norm against the use of nuclear weapons has been reaffirmed a number of times, including through G20 statements, through individual statements of countries. So that's important. So there are some things there. Oh, did I? Sorry, the QR code. I can't see it under these dialogue boxes. The QR code I've put there is the Nuclear Abolition Day appeal. What it does is that picks up on some of the recommendations in this section on the People's Pact for the Future, and takes them forward into the UN process. And if you haven't signed the appeal, you can. We'll be presenting it to the NPT review conference in a couple of weeks. Now, the more general disarmament, backwards military budgets have increased to 2.6 trillion. In Europe, that's similar, increase in budgets. Also, in some of the disarmament treaties are under strain. So there's been recent withdrawals from the Landmines Convention from a number of European countries. Looking the other way, maintaining ground of progress. Globally, I'd say not much. It's hard to see progress on the global scale. But in many countries, there has been progress at a national level. A lot on small arms and small weapons and firearms. I've just put in here one example of From Arms to Farms, and you can find out more about it in the QR code, which is a wonderful demilitarization disarmament process within the Philippines. There are some other good examples of that. There's also some traction towards the fourth UN special session on disarmament. The UN General Assembly has agreed to it in principle, but they haven't yet set up the date or the agenda for that. So that's something which could be taken forward. And another area which is off on the side, but it's very important, is there's more ESG investing, is excluding prohibited weapons. So ESG is, of course, the environment, social, and governance principles. The prohibited weapons are the ones that may not be accepted globally as prohibited, but in general they are. So they've got treaties, biological, chemical, and nuclear, and also landmines and cluster munitions. So that's there. The UN ODA has been following up on the Summit of the Future on this particular item with a consultation process that then came out with a report. I've got the link, information there on the impact of increase in military spending on SDGs. So that's also worth looking at. And then finally, I'm just going to come back to the People's Pact for the Future, because what the People's Pact for the Future did was connect very much what I've been talking about, which is pretty much the disarmament side of things, with what Rebecca was talking about, which is the importance of international law and the judicial institutions, connecting these through the framework of common security, which is in the People's Pact for the Future we explained, and that was a very important framework in there. And that, of course, is the approach of achieving security without compromising the security of others. It relies on the rejecting the threat or use of force, which of course is illegal under the UN Charter, on the peaceful means of conflict resolution through diplomacy, negotiation, and the rule of law, the judicial institutions. Disarmament helps facilitate this, and this helps facilitate disarmament. So in the People's Pact for the Future, these connections are very, very clear. They are also in many of the UN documents, like the UN Secretary General's agenda for disarmament includes a lot of those connections, and some of the recommendations that we have in the People's Pact for the Future, which are also in the nuclear abolition appeal, which I mentioned earlier, make that connection with common security. Like this one, straight out of the People's Pact for the Future, says replace the catastrophic policies of nuclear deterrence with an inclusive approach to achieving common security. And that can provide a basis then for commencing the negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, thank you. It's so wonderful to be able to welcome you here in Europe to bring your energy to these critically important issues of international peace and security. Not all bad news, but I'm afraid the clouds are threatening over all of us here. So I'm very happy to note that Natalia Martinez Cutillas, who works at the Ahtisaari Peace Foundation Crisis Management Institute has been listening to this. So, Natalia, if you have a moment, do just add your comments on chapter 2 that you've heard from Rebecca and Alan. The floor is yours.
Hi, hello. Yes, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and thank you also to the organizing entities. It's a very interesting discussion, and yes, I just wanted to briefly talk about. Well, I know that there has already been a lot of scene setting, right? And Sophia also already mentioned how the Pact for the Future really was adopted in such a different global context than the one we have today, right? And I also feel like the actions of the Pact for the Future, because they are member state commitments, and of course some decide to move on that direction, some others don't. They're ambitious, they're broad. Well, it makes it a bit difficult to track, right? I feel like we're in a situation where of course, I mean, I think, of course, we're all aware of like how trust among member states is really declining. Interstate conflict it's at their highest level since Second World War, and then all of this is also it's taking place in an environment where there is, a declining funding, right? And Guillaume also mentioned it before how it is very challenging to fulfill these actions and these objectives with the current financial situation. Then also Alan also mentioned these deprioritization of the, for example, women, peace and security agenda. And we can say from where we sit that we also really see it in Brussels, right? That there's really a political deprioritization. And then there's also other decisions, like, for example, this possible merger of UN Women with UNFPA that also kind of further indicate this trend. So of course, this is not reassuring, but it's clear that it's not all bad news, and that from where we sit, we also see some encouraging developments. But we have to say that we see. So we see, for example, the UN Secretariat clearly stepping up efforts to support civil society participation in peace-building processes. And the example that I want to draw on is the CSO-UN Dialogue on Peacebuilding, which I don't know if you're aware of the initiative, but CMI co-chaired it last year, and then we have been involved in it from the start. So we've really seen it evolve. This is basically an initiative that aims to create and systematize entry points for civil society to engage with the UN peacebuilding architecture. And we have to say that at the beginning, which it started in like 2023, the purpose wasn't very clear. UN participation was very low and engagement with member states was very limited. But now we're entering its fourth year, and we can see a clear commitment from the UN side. So we see like that senior leadership engagement has increased. The participation is much broader across the system, with attendance not only from the peace building pillar, but also human rights, humanitarian and development pillars, as well as a bunch of UN agencies. And then there's also more openness to bringing civil society into the Peace Building Commission, of course, mostly as briefers. But we see an effort to go beyond like the usual suspects, right? Which we think that it's really a great step. Then before it was also mentioned the importance of regional approaches, and the UN Secretariat is also really doubling down on these efforts to make these dialogues regional. And I think that this ties in very well with the Pact for the Future's focus on inclusiveness, right? And all the actions across chapters that also talk about this inclusiveness. So that is a very positive thing. And then I just wanted to lastly say an opportunity that we see, because of course the UN Security Council deals with the most pressing peace and security issues, right? And it has long been paralyzed by these political divisions among its permanent members, and also the growing reliance of the use of vetoes. And of course, this dynamic is hampering its ability to respond to these two major crises that are going on. But European members make up 1/3 of the Council, including both permanent and non-permanent members. So we think that this really creates an opportunity to rethink how Europe engages with the UN Security Council, not also talking about coordination and messaging, but also in shaping priorities, and most of all in building coalitions, right? In building new partnerships, maybe with the A3s, or with African members, or with the elected 10, or also other formats across the General Assembly. And we see that there are some efforts efforts around this happening, but we believe that European members are really uniquely positioned to collectively explore opportunities to strengthen the Council effectiveness. And from a Brussels perspective, we also see how the UN agenda has really seemed to have lost some visibility, and there is a clear need to bring back up this agenda in Brussels, and an opportunity also for EU member states on the UN Security Council to better shape priorities and also strategies on EU relevant issues here. Yes, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia. And yes, thank you for reminding us that we do have 3 European members on the Security Council, and a third of the membership is European. So we do actually have a lot of power in the Security Council and should lead on that security issue. Thank you so much to all 3 speakers on the Chapter 2. We now move to the Global Digital Compact and the issue of digital governance, exploring the key priorities of the compact and how European actors can contribute to shaping inclusive, rights-based digital transformation at the global regional levels. And if you remember, the GDC has 5 core pillars, core objectives, which are connectivity and capacity building, universal connectivity by 2030, an inclusive digital economy for women and vulnerable populations as well, safe, secure digital space for young people, and protection against disinformation, data governance, and AI governance. And to lead us through this policy minefield, we're very lucky to have Luigi Di Marco, an analyst specializing in EU policies and ESDGs, currently leading the European Union's SDG Policy Observatory at the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development, where he authors and co-leads key reports. He also brings prior experience as head of technical services and sustainable development policies in Italian local public administration. So he combines policy expertise with practical governance implementation. Luigi, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for your invitation. This for me is really a precious possibility to share ideas and views together. Well, the GDP, the Global Digital Compact. So, starting from the preamble, leaders have declared that digital technologies that are transforming our world offer enormous potential benefits for the well-being and progress of people, promising to accelerate the achievement of SDGs. But they specified that this can only happen through strengthening international cooperation that bridges all digital divides between and within countries. Well, the main issue is that we need peace to cooperate for the follow-up, not only for the GDC, of course, but for all the package of the Pact of the Future. And a current follow-up is also an enabling condition for peace. So selecting the key priority for peace through the digital environment, of course, I underline information integrity, and that is a chapter of the GDC, and improvement of digital literacy without leaving no one behind. And the question is, from where we start, from global or national level? Well, I think that the answer is fundamental to explore how the 2 levels are interlinked, multilateral and national. And civil society have to ask their own government to be accountable on what they are doing at multilateral and how they translate their global commitment at national level, as also, and this last but least, in the bilateral agreements with other countries. Well, good news is that Despite the growing geopolitical disorder, following the GDC in 2025, we had new important results. We have chapters dedicated to the GDC implementation, for instance, in the Seville Commitment, in the Doha Declaration, as also in the Mundiacal Declaration, Mundiacal 2025 new declaration, also in the G20 declaration in South Africa without the United States, as we know. The UN General Assembly adopted at the end of last year a resolution, promotion and protection of human rights in the context of digital technologies, that the vast majority of countries have endorsed with a yes. And last but not least, the establishment of the UN panel of experts on AI and the launch of the global dialogue on AI governance. So the knowledge of these new commitments represents new important leverage point for civil society organization on asking their own countries at member states level to keep the promises and to be accountable and coherent. Italy is part, as other 26 countries, is part of an organism that is called European Union, as you know. And well, it is important to underline that, recalling the commitment of the GDC, the European Commission has adopted the international digital strategy for the European Union. The EU have open discussion and partnership agreements already signed with many member states in the broader Europe continent, as in all the world, with India, Mercosur, Asian country, Japan, Canada, Australia, etc. And these agreements are concerning collaboration on digital and AI issues. So EU choices have important reflex in the choices adopted in other parts of the world. And the Global Digital Compact is an important diplomatic tools, I can say, to achieve this agreement. We need common rules to progress. But there are some concern about the rationale. The rules are harming competitiveness. This is a concern that I underlined at the EU level mainly. The European Commission in last November 2025 has adopted a digital omnibus. The proposed rules aim to simplify bureaucratic process and reduce cost for business, and that is good, but it happens that the European Data Protection Board, as also the European Data Protection Supervisor, have expressed their concern about the new rules adopted that can adversely affect the level of protection enjoyed by individuals and make it more difficult for data subjects to exercise their rights. It means that simplification have not access to be consistent with the Global Digital Compact and fundamental rights. Just a final remarks. Digitalization, including AI, are power accelerator tools, as we know. But until the business and the economy is not aligned with sustainable goals, as it is today, not aligned, accelerating means accelerating the disaster. Therefore, simplification without impact assessment, or worse, endorsing the ideology that avoiding rules in the digital and AI domains is better for competitiveness, means accelerating the path toward the future we don't want, the dystopian future we don't want. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Luigi. And we'll have to leave the digital issue there because we're moving on to the issue of youth engagement and future generations, which is the other annex to the the Pact for the Future, and one which we have worked on very hard here in Europe. And Erica Bohl had to leave, but I hope that the organizers can allow me to show the slide about the European Intergenerational Fairness Strategy, which was launched here in Brussels in March 2026. But we'll go first to Carter Cheng, a global policy leader and World Economic Forum Future 50 leader, who serves as the regional co-lead for Europe and Eurasia on the 2026 Intergenerational Foresight Handbook, and as vice president for global operations at the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Institute. She's a PhD researcher at the University of Cambridge and regional focal point for Europe at the UNCCD Youth Caucus, where she focuses on international law, geopolitics, and emerging technologies. Carter, I hope you're still here with us. Please go. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, David. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm Carter, speaking on behalf of the World Economic Forum Future 50 Europe and Eurasian team. And it's a privilege to contribute to this discussion to reflect not simply on how we can improve multilateralism, but whether our system of governance are actually capable of acting across time. So please let me begin very briefly with our work. So in the Wealth Intergenerational Foresight Handbook, we start from a simple but uncomfortable observation that we find that the governance today is structurally short-term, while the challenges we face from climate change to technological disruption are long-term and cumulative. So we think that the Pact itself recognizes this tension. It opens with a clear commitment, but at the same time, the difficulty lies in how governance systems are currently designed. And so we describe this as a problem of asymmetrical influence across time, that the present has power, but then the future has none. And this produces what we call the democratic myopia cycle, where short-term incentives drive decisions that create long-term lock-ins, narrowing the choices available to future generations. And in response, we propose a shift in how we define good governance, not as control over the present, but as stewardship across time. And this rests on two core ideas. First is temporal sovereignty, preserving the ability of future generations to make meaningful choices. And then second is future optionality, evaluating whether today's decision expand or constrain tomorrow's possibilities. So how does that connect to the questions before us for this session? So we think that the Pact for the Future creates a significant opening, but it also set a very clear test. On the one hand, it contains concrete commitments, but on the other hand, it also calls for a broader transformation of global governance to a system that are more representative, inclusive, accountable, and prepared for future challenges. And importantly, it frames these commitments within a wider recognition that the multilateral system must be made fit for the future and the present and the future. And this is actually where the opportunity lies, because the challenge is not simply that youth are underrepresented. It is that participation that is often episodic, consultative, and non-binding. And what intergenerational foresight suggests is that meaningful participation requires a shift from voice to authority. That means moving from ad hoc engagement to institutionalized roles for youth and future generations, embedding temporal impact assessment into policy processes, and linking participation to accountability. And in this sense, the Pact would provide the normative mandate, but without the institutional reform, that mandate would risk remaining aspirational. And this brings us to the second question, how Europe can ensure that the perspective and rights of future generations are reflected in policy decision. So we think that Europe sits in a unique position. It remains a central pillar of multilateralism, but also face structural pressures like democratic strain, geopolitical uncertainty, and the path is clear that none of its ambition can be achieved without effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions grounded in international law and cooperation. So the question is not one of capacity, but of alignment. And so from our work, three directions stand out. First is institutional embedding. So future generation must be represented not symbolically, but structurally. For example, through future commissioners, intergenerational councils, and foresight units with real influence. Second, decision-making frameworks. Policy should be assessed not for immediate outcomes, but for whether they lock systems into irreversible paths or preserve flexibility and resilience. And finally, redefining success in governance. So if political incentives remain tied to short-term delivery, then even well-designed participation mechanism will struggle to shift outcomes. So we need to move from measuring success as immediate gains to measuring it as the preservation of long-term agency. So to wrap up, the Pact for the Future tells us that it is a moment of both risk and opportunity. And what intergenerational foresight offers is not a prediction of that path, but a way of governing its presence. And ultimately, the question is not whether young people are invited into the room, it's whether decisions made in that room are actually capable of protecting the freedom of those who are not yet there. So the final word I would say is if governance is about preserving freedom, then the deepest form of freedom we can safeguard is the freedom of future generations to choose. And that should be the standard we should hold ourselves to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carter. And yeah, thank you for that very valuable information. I would just mention that this is the first in two sessions of the European Regional Futures Forum, and that the next one on a week tomorrow, Friday the 24th of April, will give us all a chance to go deeper into these policies that you're discussing today, and which we're hearing about. And I do hope, Carter, you'll be able to join us for that. Now, as I mentioned, the lady from the European Commission for Intergenerational Fairness was not able to stay with us because we're running late. So I'm going to bring up this slide about the flagship actions of the European Intergenerational Fairness Strategy, which was launched to require commitments from across the Commission. All the DGs have to include thinking about future generations in all their legislative and financial commitments. And it's a fantastic document, which my organization and some of the young people who participate with me were involved in creating. It had a citizens' assembly with 150 people from across Europe who helped create it. And the flagship actions include this Intergenerational Fairness Index, which builds on other European agencies who've been looking at the intergenerational issue since as long ago as 2011. We have, of course, the Welsh Commission for Future Generations here in the United Kingdom, which has taken a leadership position on a lot of these issues. And we hope the Intergenerational Fairness Index that the European Commission is working on will be a very useful, objective way of looking at future generations' legislation. It also has a brilliant little future balance tool, which is an AI-enabled thing, which is being co-developed with the Beyond Lab in Geneva, a United Nations agency. And that is something which we should be promoting very loudly and noisily from Europe when it is completed, hopefully before the end of the year. It can do in 20 seconds what researchers like myself have been struggling to do over years on future balancing of legislation. Um,
Sorry to interrupt. I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, Mathilde speaking. We'll actually have to close because I see it's already quarter to 4, and another C4UN call is going to take place in a few minutes on this same Zoom account. I wrote you in the chat, but it seems you were not
Sorry,
able
I
to.
didn't see that. Let me hand over to you, Mathilde, for any final questions that we have time for. Okay.
Thank you. No, very sorry to interrupt, and apologies also to the participants who raised very interesting questions into the chat. So we will have to bring the meeting to a close. Before that, let me maybe respond to one of the last questions that was raised on the chat from Hernan about the next session. The question is whether, as you probably all know, the European Futures Forum is taking place in 2 sessions. The next session is going to take place on the 24th of April, so in a week from now, after the EC Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. And so that session on the 24th is going to very much be a civil society dialogue. It's going to be composed of breakout groups, and there will be also an online consultation being made available. So to respond to your question, Hernan, there will be both written and verbal consultation on the various issues we've discussed today and other related issues. So please do join. If you haven't registered yet, scan the QR code and do join us next week for what is going to be a more interactive session than today, which was meant to very much be an expert briefing. I'd like to give the floor to David and Nelia for a few seconds before we completely close. And on my side, just reminding you that if you want to join the next meeting and other meetings, please sign up to C4UN's newsletter. It's the easiest way of following us and of finding all information on our various meetings. And as Adam, our executive director, mentioned in the beginning of this call, if you would like to work with us more closely or just being involved in implementing our mandate through your mandate more actively, you can join us as a member. It's free of charge, but it gives you a number of advantages, and we're going to paste the link into the chat. Thank you so much. Over to you, David, for some concluding words as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mathilde. And just finally, I would say, as Ishan mentioned earlier on, these civil society initiatives, C4UN in particular, has carried the charge to open the door at the UN for greater civil society participation. And the door is much more open than it ever has been. And that's largely due to the efforts of people like you, Mathilde, and Adam. So thank you for that. But for goodness sake, let's all use that open door and participate as fully as we possibly can. Thank you so much. Nelia, over to you.
Yeah, I just would like to thank everyone again, all the speakers and everyone who joined today this event. And yeah, it was a long preparation process, and I'm happy that we managed, even we have to close without Q&A session, but still, I think it was great discussion. And I'm trying to copy paste the links. So Mathilde, if you can copy them from the file, because I somehow have a difficulties here. So thank you very much, everyone. And I just would like to say that for those who don't know, there is actually a regional forum will be happening between our 2 sessions in Geneva. And it will start on Monday with a civil society meeting, and on 21st and 22nd there will be official sessions at UNECE. So it's European Forum on Sustainable Development, and we will have also a side event on UN 80 there, which will also feed our discussion on 24th, because we will have a speaker on 24th about what happened at the regional forum. I hope that I covered everything, and let me know if there is anything else left. But yeah, thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Mathilde and Adam, and every speaker. I just will not list everyone. It's a long list. So thank you very much for joining and giving this input.